I was in the back stocking shelves when I heard my coworker screaming from the cash register, "Don't touch me! Please!" I dropped everything and ran toward the register immediately, where I saw Johnny, the deputy sheriff's son, pinning her behind the counter while his friend stuffed whiskey and cigarettes into his backpack. My coworker Jamie was crying, holding her arm against her chest when she saw him eyeing where he shouldn't. "You know I like my women older," Johnny laughed. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and started recording, shouting, I have you on video. Now let her go." Jamie ran behind me while Johnny was distracted. He tried to take a swing at me but missed when I ducked. A few bottles crashed onto the floor as he stumbled forward. I managed to grab his shoulder to keep him from falling into the broken glass and shove him aside. Johnny's friend dragged him toward the door while Johnny screamed, "When my daddy hears about this, it's over. Say goodbye to your shop." He spat on the floor before running off. Jamie's shoulders trembled while she apologized for the trouble. I smiled gently back at her. "The kids always cause trouble. It's not your fault. Go rest in the back while I clean this place up, all right?" Her eyes filled with tears as she nodded. I grabbed a broom from the janitor's closet and started gathering the shards when Johnny's father, the town sheriff, walked in looking upset. "I heard you hurt my son. I don't know if you've got guts or if you're just stupid," he said slowly, puffing his chest up. I told him he'd gotten it wrong and even showed him the footage. When he said it wasn't enough, I pulled up the store's security footage too. It looks like Johnny was just shopping and being friendly with the girl. Before you came over and almost smashed him into glass bottles. I was shocked. "Watch your back," he warned. He left the store after that without fuss, and that's when the real trouble started. I came to work the next day to find someone had painted "Snitches Get Stitches" across our front windows. And when Jamie came clocked out that day, she found that her car had gotten keyed and the front window had been smashed with a brick and a message attached. The message was so bad I went out and bought 8 security cameras to install into the store that night. Even added a hidden security alarm under the cashier desk that someone could press that set off all the alarms. So when I found my front window broken into and $1,000 missing 2 days later, I instantly checked all the new cameras. My heart raced when the image came up clear, and I caught Johnny grinning and committing all the violent acts. I quickly drove into town and filed a case against him with the state police, who were left with no choice but to investigate properly this time. But since Johnny was still the sheriff's son, he was let off with 2 weeks of community service and an apology letter, while his dad had to pay off $5,000 in damages. You'd think things would have just stopped there, right? For 3 weeks it did. Our store didn't get damaged. Jamie got back into the groove at work, and Johnny was nowhere to be found, only to find out later just how obsessed Johnny had gotten with us over the weeks. He'd been watching us from the store across the road, secretly tailing Jamie all the way to her home every night to learn her routine. He knew we'd be alone in the store for her birthday party that Saturday. He knew we'd have our guard down, and that's when he chose to strike. That Saturday evening, we just cut Jamie's birthday cake when the lights went out. The front door suddenly burst in while Johnny stumbled in, drunk and waving his father's backup service pistol in the air. People screamed, running in all directions while he grinned and shouted, "Now raise your fricking hands if you're a snitch. Raise 'em high for me." Jamie collapsed on the floor at the sight of him. Johnny smiled and pointed the pistol at her, then at me, his hand shaking violently. Just as his fingers pulled on the trigger, I ducked over and threw the cash register at Johnny. He fell backward into a shelf and hit his head on the sharp corner, and Jamie, who had fallen on the floor, clutched at her heart, fighting the heart attack that had hit her. Minutes later, the doors swung open and the sheriff himself stepped in. His eyes landed on Johnny, who was bleeding out on the floor, before turning to me with his eyes full of rage. I raised both my hands slowly, keeping them where he could see them clearly. The sheriff's right hand moved toward his belt, and I could see his fingers twitching near his service weapon. My mouth went dry. Johnny was making wet, gurgling sounds on the floor between us, blood pooling under his head from where he'd hit the shelf corner. Jamie hadn't moved from where she'd collapsed, still clutching her chest with both hands, her face gray and sweaty. The sirens I'd triggered were getting louder now, maybe 2 blocks away, and I watched the sheriff's jaw clench tight as he realized state police were coming. His eyes kept darting between me and his son, and I was scared he'd shoot me before backup arrived. I kept my hands up and tried to keep my voice steady. Time felt strange, like everything was moving in slow motion while my heart hammered against my ribs. The sheriff took a step toward me and I flinched backward into a shelf. 2 state troopers suddenly burst through the front door with their weapons drawn, yelling commands I couldn't quite process through the ringing in my ears. The sheriff had no choice but to step back from me, his hand moving away from his weapon. I started talking immediately, my words tumbling out fast. I told them about the hidden alarm I'd pressed under the counter, pointed up at the 8 cameras I'd installed that caught everything. The lead trooper was tall with graying hair at his temples, and his name tag read, Foster. Doug Foster took one look at the situation, saw Johnny bleeding on the floor, and Jamie collapsed nearby and pulled out his radio to call for multiple ambulances and a supervisor. His partner moved to secure the pistol that had fallen near Johnny when I threw the register. The sheriff started to say something, but Doug held up one hand to stop him. The EMTs rushed in maybe 3 minutes later and split into 2 teams right away. One team dropped down next to Johnny, working on his head wound, checking his pupils with a small flashlight, pressing gauze against the bleeding. The other team went straight to Jamie, checking her pulse at her wrist and neck, asking her questions she could barely answer. I watched them load Jamie onto a stretcher first, and she reached out with one shaking hand as they wheeled her past me. I grabbed it and squeezed, trying to tell her without words that she'd be okay. The sheriff tried to follow his son's stretcher toward the ambulance outside, but Doug Foster stepped in front of him. He told the sheriff firmly that he needed to stay for questioning. The sheriff's face went red, but 3 state troopers were now securing the scene, taking photos, marking evidence with little yellow tent markers. Doug asked me to walk him through exactly what happened, and my hands were still shaking as I pulled out my phone. I showed him the footage I'd started recording the second Johnny burst through the door. Doug watched Johnny stumbling in drunk, waving the pistol in the air, pointing it at Jamie, then at me. He watched me duck and throw the cash register, watched Johnny fall backward into the shelf. Then I offered to pull up the store cameras, which had even better angles. Doug's face stayed neutral the whole time, but I could see him taking detailed notes in a small notebook, and he kept circling back to write more about the sheriff's backup weapon being used. He asked specific questions about timing, about whether Johnny said anything before I threw the register, about where exactly everyone was standing. I answered everything as clearly as I could, though my voice kept cracking. The sheriff kept interrupting my statement every few minutes, claiming I'd attacked his son without cause, saying Johnny was just confused and scared. Doug cut him off firmly each time. He explained in a flat, professional voice that given the clear conflict of interest with the sheriff being the suspect's father, state police would be handling the entire investigation from here forward. The sheriff's face went from red to almost purple, and I could see a vein throbbing in his forehead. But there was nothing he could do with 3 state troopers now measuring distances, photographing blood spatter, documenting the broken glass and scattered birthday cake. Another supervisor arrived and immediately started talking to Doug in low tones while looking over at the sheriff. I heard the word jurisdiction mentioned several times. Doug had his team collect the pistol as evidence, and I watched one trooper carefully photograph it from multiple angles before bagging it. They were documenting the chain of custody with forms and labels, while the sheriff protested loudly. He kept saying it was his department's weapon and should stay in his custody. Doug ignored him completely. I mentioned to Doug that this wasn't the first incident, that there'd been weeks of stalking and prior violence. Doug's expression sharpened with interest immediately. He asked if I had documentation of everything, and I told him about my evidence folders at home, the receipts from installing the new camera system, all the footage of previous break-ins. Doug made more notes and asked for my contact information to follow up. Another trooper was interviewing the party guests who were still huddled in the back room, all of them shaking and crying. I could hear him asking questions about what they saw, getting their contact information, having them write down statements. Several of them had recorded parts of the incident on their phones when Johnny first came in, and Doug collected those as additional evidence, having each person fill out a form about what their footage showed. The sheriff tried one more time to claim jurisdiction, saying this was his town and his department's case. Doug reminded him calmly that this involved his own son and a weapon registered to his department, which created an obvious conflict that required outside investigation. The sheriff finally went quiet, but the look he gave me as I left with Doug promised this wasn't over between us. I finally got to the hospital around midnight after spending hours giving my statement at the state police barracks. I found Jamie in the ER hooked up to monitors that beeped steadily, showing her heart rate and blood pressure on green glowing screens. An IV line ran into her left arm, an oxygen tube sat under her nose. The nurse at the station told me they were running tests for a possible mild heart attack triggered by extreme stress. Jamie's hands were still trembling against the white sheets when I walked into her curtained area. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and immediately started apologizing for ruining her own birthday party. I pulled a plastic chair close to her bed and told her to stop being ridiculous, that none of this was her fault. I sat with Jamie while doctors came in and out, running an EKG that left sticky patches on her chest, taking blood from her arm for various tests. I held her hand, careful not to disturb the IV line, and told her over and over that this wasn't her fault. She admitted quietly that she'd been having chest pains and anxiety for weeks, but didn't want to worry anyone or seem weak. A cardiologist came in around 1:30, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes who introduced herself quickly. She explained they were keeping Jamie overnight for observation and starting her on medication for stress-induced cardiac symptoms. The tests showed elevated enzyme levels that suggested her heart had been under serious strain. She needed rest, needed to avoid stress, needed to follow up with a cardiologist next week. Jamie nodded at everything, but I could see fresh tears sliding down her cheeks. Gene called me at 2 a.m, his voice tight with worry, asking what the hell happened and whether the store was secure. I was walking back to check the building, my feet aching in my shoes, exhaustion making everything feel fuzzy and distant. I explained everything while I walked, the whole terrible night spilling out in a rush of words. When I got to the store, I found state police tape stretched across the entrance in big yellow X patterns, and a trooper was stationed outside in his patrol car. Gene's voice sounded shaken on the phone, older somehow. He told me to take tomorrow off, that he was coming in first thing to assess the damage himself. I stood on the sidewalk staring at my workplace, at the broken door and the police tape, and wondered how everything had gotten so completely out of control. I walked back to my apartment in the dark, my feet hurting and my brain too tired to process anything anymore. The couch felt hard when I collapsed onto it, still wearing my work clothes. I kept my phone next to me in case the hospital called about Jamie. Sleep wouldn't come no matter how exhausted I felt. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Johnny's finger pulling that trigger, saw the pistol pointing at Jamie's face while she collapsed on the floor. My hands started shaking again just thinking about it. I got up around 3 a.m. and made coffee that I didn't drink. Around 6 a.m., I gave up completely on sleep and pulled out my laptop. I started organizing everything into folders on my desktop. Every photo of the damage to the store went into one folder. Every video from the security cameras went into another. I found all the receipts from buying the 8 cameras and the hidden alarm system. I made a timeline document listing every incident with exact dates and times. The first assault and robbery attempt, the painted windows, Jamie's keyed car, the break-in with the $1,000 stolen, the stalking that we didn't know about until it was too late, the birthday party attack. My phone rang at 8 a.m. and I jumped so hard I spilled cold coffee on my pants. Doug Foster's name showed on the screen. He asked if I could come to the state police barracks to go through everything systematically with him. I grabbed my laptop, my phone, and a USB drive where I'd backed up all the security footage. The drive to the barracks took 20 minutes through empty morning roads. Doug met me in a small interview room with a table and uncomfortable plastic chairs. He spent 3 hours going through every single incident in order from the beginning. He took detailed notes in a leather notebook, writing down exact times and asking specific questions about who witnessed what. He wanted to know if anyone else saw Johnny pin Jamie behind the counter that first night. He asked about the customers who were at the birthday party and whether I had their contact information. He watched each security video twice, pausing to write down details I hadn't even noticed. Doug leaned back in his chair after reviewing the footage from the birthday party attack. He told me the pistol was processed for prints and gunshot residue at the state lab. The results would prove Johnny was waving it around and threatening people. He explained that even though Johnny was only 17, the severity of the charges meant the DA's office would likely try him as an adult. Armed assault, making terroristic threats, stalking, violating his probation from the earlier incident. Doug mentioned that the sheriff had already hired an expensive lawyer from 2 counties over. The lawyer was apparently claiming Johnny was having a mental health crisis and didn't understand what he was doing. I asked Doug the question that had been eating at me since the sheriff showed up. What about me throwing the cash register at Johnny? Could I get charged with assault? Doug didn't sugarcoat it. He said the sheriff was pushing hard to have me charged, claiming I used excessive force and caused his son's head injury. But Doug also said the video clearly showed self-defense. Johnny had a loaded pistol pointed at people, and his finger was on the trigger. The DA's office would have the final say on whether to charge me. Doug strongly advised me to get my own lawyer just in case, someone who could represent me if the sheriff managed to pressure the DA into filing charges. My anxiety shot through the roof hearing that. I didn't have money for a lawyer. Doug wrote down a name on a piece of paper and slid it across the table. Meredith Hull, an attorney in the next town over who handled criminal defense and had experience with cases involving law enforcement. He said to mention his name when I called. I left the state police barracks feeling worse than when I arrived. The afternoon sun was too bright after sitting in that windowless room for 3 hours. Gene called me while I was driving and asked if I could meet him at the store. I found him standing in the parking lot staring at the police tape across the entrance. We went inside together through the back door that the state police had left unlocked for us. The damage looked even worse in daylight. The front door hung crooked on broken hinges. Birthday cake was smashed into the floor, ground in by people running and the EMTs rushing through. Johnny's blood had dried in a dark stain on the shelf where his head hit the corner. Gene walked around slowly, his hands in his pockets, not saying anything for a long time. Finally, he told me the corporate office was worried about liability and insurance premiums. 2 major incidents in less than 2 months. An employee in the hospital with cardiac problems. A minor injured on the premises. Gene didn't say it directly, but I could hear the question underneath his words. Was I worth all this trouble? My phone rang while I was sweeping up broken glass. Jamie's cousin told me Jamie was discharged from the hospital that afternoon. The doctors gave her strict instructions to avoid stress and take cardiac medication every single day. She needed to see a cardiologist for follow-up appointments. They also recommended she start therapy to deal with the trauma of what happened. I felt guilty listening to the list of things Jamie had to do now because I'd confronted Johnny that first night. I knew rationally that Johnny chose to escalate things, that he chose violence over and over, but I still wondered if I could have handled it differently somehow. A woman showed up at my apartment door that evening holding a notebook and a voice recorder. She introduced herself as Catherine Mercier from the local newspaper. She wanted to interview me about the incident at the convenience store. I almost shut the door in her face because I knew the sheriff controlled most of the local media. But something about the way she asked made me think she actually wanted to hear the full story. I invited her inside and showed her my laptop with the timeline I'd created, every incident listed with dates and evidence. She took notes while I walked her through everything that had happened over the past 2 months. She asked good questions about things I hadn't thought were important. How many times had Johnny come into the store before the first assault? Had anyone from the sheriff's department ever responded to calls at our location? I agreed to let her quote me on the record and gave her copies of some of the security footage. 2 days passed and I jumped every time my phone rang. Doug called me on Wednesday morning with an update. The lab had confirmed Johnny's fingerprints all over the pistol. Gunshot residue on his hands was consistent with someone waving a firearm around in an enclosed space. The ballistics team had recovered the bullet that missed me. It was embedded in the wall behind the cash register, right where my head had been before I ducked. Doug also mentioned that someone named Evangeline Quinn from the DA's office was reviewing the case personally. She was the assistant district attorney, and apparently she was taking over because of how high-profile everything had become. I was loading groceries into my car at the supermarket on Thursday when the sheriff appeared next to me. His voice came out low and threatening as he moved closer. He accused me of trying to destroy his family, of attacking his son, and then lying about it to make himself look like a victim. I slipped my hand into my pocket and started my phone's voice recorder without looking at it. The sheriff kept talking, listing all the ways he could make my life difficult in this town. He knew people, he said. He could make sure I never got another job, could make sure the DA's office saw things his way. A woman pushing a shopping cart noticed us and stopped. She asked if I was okay, her eyes moving between me and the sheriff. The sheriff stepped back immediately, his face changing into a fake smile. He told the woman everything was fine, just a friendly conversation. But before he walked away, he leaned close and said this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I sat in my car for 10 minutes after he left, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I called the number Doug had given me for Meredith Hull and left a message asking for an appointment. She called back within an hour and told me to come by her office the next morning. Meredith's office was in a small building above a coffee shop in the next town over. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her 30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. I showed her everything on my laptop while she took notes on a yellow legal pad. She reviewed the security footage, the timeline, the photos of damage, even the receipts for the cameras I'd installed. She was impressed by how well I'd documented everything, but she also warned me that small-town politics could be tricky, especially when going up against the sheriff. Juries knew him, respected him, might not want to believe he'd cover for his son. Her retainer was $1,500, which was more than I had in my savings account, but Meredith offered me a payment plan, $300 a month until it was paid off. She said my case was strong enough that she was willing to take that risk. The documentation I'd gathered was better than what most of her clients brought her. I signed her retainer agreement right there in her office, my hand cramping as I wrote my name at the bottom. The next morning at work, Gene called me into his office and closed the door behind us. He looked tired, rubbing his face while he pulled out some papers from corporate. They wanted me gone, he explained, worried about more incidents bringing bad press and insurance problems. But Gene said he'd been pushing back hard because what happened wasn't my fault, and I'd done everything right. We talked for 20 minutes about options before settling on a compromise. My hours got cut temporarily, and I'd work day shifts only until everything calmed down. It wasn't perfect, but it kept me employed and paid. Gene shook my hand before I left his office and told me to keep documenting everything like I'd been doing. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Evangeline Quinn introduced herself and asked if I could come to the DA's office for an interview about the case. I told her I'd bring my attorney, and she said that was smart. Meredith met me in the parking lot outside the courthouse building where the DA's office was located. We walked in together and got directed to a small conference room with a table and chairs. Evangeline came in carrying a thick folder and a yellow notepad. She was maybe 40, wearing a dark suit, and her expression stayed serious the whole time. She started asking questions about every single interaction I'd had with Johnny, going back months before the first assault. How many times had he come into the store? Had he ever threatened me directly before? What about Jamie? I answered everything while Meredith took notes beside me. Evangeline kept circling back to the stalking behavior, asking detailed questions about the weeks between the community service and the birthday party. She wanted to know if Jamie would be willing to give a statement about being followed home. I told her I'd ask but couldn't promise anything given Jamie's health situation. The interview lasted almost 2 hours and my throat was dry by the end. Evangeline thanked me and said she'd be in touch soon about next steps. I drove to Jamie's cousin's place that afternoon, a small house on the edge of town with a neat front yard. Jamie answered the door looking exhausted, dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She invited me in, and we sat at the kitchen table while her cousin gave us privacy. I explained what Evangeline had asked about and watched Jamie's face tighten with worry. But then she surprised me by pulling out a spiral notebook from her bag. She'd been keeping a journal, she said, of every time she felt like someone was watching her. I opened it and saw pages of entries going back 6 weeks before the party. Each entry had a date, time, and description. Johnny's car following her route home. Johnny sitting in the parking lot across from the store. Johnny driving past her cousin's house slowly. The detail was incredible, and my hands shook a little holding it. Jamie said she'd started writing everything down after the brick through her car window because she wanted proof if things got worse. I asked if she'd be okay talking to Evangeline, and she nodded, her jaw set with determination. She wasn't going to let Johnny get away with what he'd done to us. Doug called me 3 days later with news that made my stomach flip. The state police had pulled security footage from businesses across the street from our store. The footage showed Johnny's car parked in the same spot for hours on multiple days, with clear shots of him sitting behind the wheel watching our entrance. They had him on camera for at least 8 different days over 3 weeks. Combined with Jamie's journal and statements from neighbors who'd noticed his car, they had solid proof of stalking and planning. Doug said Evangeline was considering adding more charges beyond the armed intrusion. The evidence was piling up, and even the sheriff's expensive lawyer would have trouble explaining it away. I thanked Doug and hung up feeling a weird mix of relief and dread. Relief that the truth was coming out, but dread about what would happen next. Meredith called that evening to tell me the preliminary hearing was set for 2 weeks out. She explained this was when the judge would decide if there was enough evidence to send Johnny to trial. With all the video footage and documentation we had, she felt confident about the outcome. But she warned me the sheriff's lawyer would try hard to paint Johnny as a troubled kid who made a mistake. They'd probably attack my character and decisions, trying to make me look aggressive or unstable. Meredith said we needed to be ready for them to twist everything and make me seem like the bad guy. I asked what I should do, and she told me to stay calm, stick to facts, and not react no matter what they said about me. The next 2 weeks were going to be rough, but we had truth on our side. The newspaper hit stands on a Wednesday morning with Catherine's article taking up half the front page. The headline read exactly what she told me it would be. I bought a copy at the gas station and read through it in my car. She'd laid out the whole timeline without making it dramatic or fake, just facts and dates and what actually happened. Within 3 hours, the sheriff's office released their own statement claiming I was violent and had a history of confrontation. It was completely made up, but other local news outlets picked it up and started running with it. By that afternoon, I was getting tagged in social media posts calling me a liar and worse. My phone kept buzzing with notifications until I had to turn them off. The harassment got worse over the next few days. People I'd never met were sending me messages calling me a snitch and saying I'd attacked a kid for no reason. Someone created a fake account using my name and posted lies about Jamie. I screenshot everything like Meredith had told me to do. At work, Jean had to physically remove 2 customers who came in just to yell at me about what I'd supposedly done to Johnny. One of them got in my face calling me trash before Jean threatened to call the cops. My sleep got worse and I stopped eating regular meals because my stomach stayed in knots. Meredith reviewed all the screenshots I sent her and said to keep documenting but try not to engage with anyone online. The stress was getting to me bad, but I focused on the upcoming hearing and getting through each day. Doug's next call came on a Friday afternoon, and his voice sounded different, more intense. The forensics team had found something at the store. Someone had tampered with the breaker box behind the building the night of the party, deliberately cutting power to create darkness for Johnny's entrance. They'd found fresh tool marks on the box and were checking for prints. This proved Johnny had planned everything, not just shown up drunk and angry like his lawyer was claiming. The premeditation made the charges more serious and strengthened the case significantly. Doug said Evangeline was excited about this evidence because it destroyed the troubled kid having a crisis defense. I felt sick thinking about how much planning had gone into that night. Jamie's cardiologist appointment happened the next week, and the news wasn't great. She called me afterward sounding defeated. The doctor said she needed to stay on heart medication for at least 6 months and avoid high-stress situations basically forever. That meant she couldn't come back to her cashier job where the attack happened. Jamie was devastated about losing her income, and I could hear her trying not to cry on the phone. I told her I'd talk to Jean about options. The next day, Jean called Jamie in and offered her a position doing inventory management in the back room. The hours would be reduced, but she'd still have a job and income. Jamie accepted and thanked him about 5 times before hanging up. At least something was working out. Evangeline scheduled a prep session for Jamie and me 1 week before the preliminary hearing. We met at the DA's office again with Meredith coming along to add her advice. Evangeline spent 2 hours coaching us on how to answer questions clearly and stick to facts without adding opinions or emotions. She explained the sheriff's lawyer would try to rattle us and make us seem unreliable or confused. They might ask the same question different ways trying to trip us up. Meredith jumped in with her own advice about staying calm under cross-examination and not getting defensive even when they attacked our character. By the end of the session, my head was spinning with all the do's and don'ts, but I felt more prepared than before. Evangeline told us to get good rest the night before the hearing and wear professional clothes. This was our chance to show the judge exactly what Johnny had done and why he needed to face real consequences. 3 days before the hearing, I walked out to my car in the apartment parking lot and found both front tires completely flat. I crouched down and saw clean slash marks across the rubber, deliberate cuts that couldn't be anything but vandalism. My hands started shaking as I pulled out my phone and took pictures from every angle. The parking lot didn't have security cameras in this section, which whoever did this probably knew. I called Doug and he drove over within 20 minutes to take a report. He walked around my car with his notepad out, documenting everything, but his face told me what I already knew. Without witnesses or footage, there wasn't much they could do except file the report for documentation. The timing felt like a clear message, 3 days before I had to testify. I called a tire shop and nearly choked when they quoted me $300 for 2 new tires. Money I definitely didn't have after paying Meredith's retainer and missing work shifts. I used my credit card and watched the charges pile up while the mechanic installed the replacements. Doug suggested I start parking in more visible locations near streetlights or building entrances where people could see my car. I moved my parking spot that same day to right under the main entrance lights, where residents walked past constantly. The night before the hearing, I sat at my kitchen table staring at a sandwich I couldn't eat. My stomach felt like it had a rock in it every time I thought about walking into that courtroom. I pulled out my timeline of events for the 100th time, reading through each date and detail obsessively. The words started blurring together, but I kept reviewing everything, terrified I'd forget something important or mess up under questioning. My phone rang around 8 and Meredith's name flashed on the screen. She reminded me to wear professional clothes, nothing too casual but nothing too fancy either. Just clean pants and a button-up shirt would work fine. She told me to get good sleep and stay calm, which felt impossible with my brain racing through worst-case scenarios. I thanked her and hung up, then paced around my apartment for another hour before finally taking a melatonin. Sleep came in fits and starts, my mind filled with dreams about Johnny waving that pistol and sirens blaring and courtroom scenes where I couldn't remember any answers. I woke up 3 times during the night checking my phone to see what time it was. The courthouse parking lot was already packed when I arrived the next morning, cars filling every available space. I had to the park 2 blocks away and walk, my dress shoes clicking on the sidewalk while my stomach churned. Inside the building, the hallway outside the courtroom was crowded with people from town. I recognized some faces from the store, regular customers who'd always been friendly, but I also saw people glaring at me, whispering to each other and shaking their heads. The town was clearly split between those who believed Johnny's family and those who'd had their own problems with him over the years. Meredith met me near the courtroom doors and guided me to a bench where we could sit together. She looked professional in her suit, carrying a leather briefcase stuffed with folders. Evangeline showed up a few minutes later and nodded at us before heading inside to set up. When the bailiff called everyone in, the courtroom filled up fast with people squeezing into every available seat. I sat next to Meredith in the front row behind the prosecution table where Evangeline was organizing her materials. The judge entered and everyone stood, then sat back down when he did. Evangeline started presenting the state's evidence in a systematic way that made everything feel official and serious. She showed the video footage from my phone first, the screen displaying Johnny bursting through the door with the pistol. Then came the security camera angles showing him cutting the power at the breaker box before the party. The forensic reports went up next with photos of the tool marks and evidence of tampering. Witness statements from party guests described the terror and chaos, their words read aloud by Evangeline in a steady voice. Jamie's stalking documentation came last, her journal entries and the security footage from across the street, showing Johnny's car parked there for hours on multiple days. The judge watched everything with an expression I couldn't read, his face neutral while he took notes. Johnny's lawyer stood up when Evangeline finished and started his arguments. He claimed his client was experiencing a mental health crisis, triggered by the unjust community service sentence from the previous incident. The lawyer's voice got louder as he described how I had a pattern of aggressive behavior toward Johnny, starting with the first confrontation at the store. He said throwing the cash register was excessive force that could have killed his client, not reasonable self-defense. My jaw clenched and I started to lean forward, but Meredith's hand grabbed my arm firmly. She squeezed once and shook her head slightly, reminding me to stay quiet and let Evangeline handle it. I forced myself to sit back and breathe slowly, while the lawyer continued painting Johnny as a troubled kid who needed help, not criminal charges. The judge started asking pointed questions that cut through the lawyer's arguments. He wanted to know about the breaker box tampering and how that fit with a spontaneous mental health crisis. The lawyer stumbled through a weak answer about Johnny being confused and not thinking clearly. Then the judge asked about the stalking evidence and why Johnny had been following Jamie home for weeks, if this was just an impulsive breakdown. The lawyer tried to explain it away as coincidence and normal routes through town, but it sounded hollow even to me. The judge's final question hit hardest, asking why Johnny had access to his father's service weapon and whether proper storage protocols were followed. The sheriff's lawyer had no good answer for that one, just vague statements about family circumstances. After 2 solid hours of testimony and arguments back and forth, the judge announced his ruling. He said there was sufficient probable cause to bind Johnny over for trial on multiple felony charges, including armed assault, stalking, breaking and entering, and weapons violations. The courtroom erupted in whispers and reactions. I felt Meredith's hand on my shoulder as relief washed through me. Outside the courthouse after everything wrapped up, I was walking toward my car when the sheriff suddenly appeared in front of me. His face was red and his fists were clenched at his sides. He started to say something, but Doug stepped between us before any words came out. Doug's voice was calm but firm as he warned the sheriff about witness intimidation and how that would look to the ethics board. Catherine showed up with her camera out, filming the whole interaction from about 10 feet away. The sheriff noticed her and then spotted several other people watching from the courthouse steps. His expression shifted as he realized multiple witnesses were documenting this moment. He turned and walked away without saying anything, but the look he shot over his shoulder at me promised this fight wasn't finished. Evangeline found me near my car a few minutes later and pulled me aside to a quieter spot. She explained that the DA's office was offering Johnny a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial. He would plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for juvenile detention, probation, and mandatory counseling. Her tone was professional, but I could tell she wanted my input since I was the primary victim in all of this. I stood there feeling torn between wanting Johnny locked away for years and wanting this whole nightmare to finally end. The thought of months of trial proceedings and testimony made me exhausted just thinking about it, but the idea of him getting off with reduced charges after everything he'd done made anger burn in my chest. I told Evangeline I needed to think about it and talk to some people before giving an answer. She nodded and said to call her within 2 days with my decision. I drove straight to Jamie's cousin's place where she was still staying. She answered the door looking tired but steady, her medication keeping her heart stable even if her nerves were still shot. We sat at the kitchen table and I explained the plea deal offer, laying out all the terms Evangeline had described. Jamie listened quietly, and then surprised me with how practical her response was. She said she just wanted to feel safe again, and didn't care whether that came from a trial verdict or a plea agreement. The important thing was making sure Johnny faced real consequences and couldn't come near us anymore. Gene called me that evening after I texted him about the situation. He pointed out that a trial could drag on for months and keep bringing negative attention to the store just when things were starting to settle down. Customers were coming back and sales were recovering, but a long public trial might hurt business again. I understood his concerns even though part of me felt frustrated that money had to factor into this decision. Meredith's advice came last when I met with her the next morning. She explained that plea deals often resulted in quicker closure and less emotional toll on victims. Trials were unpredictable and could be re-traumatizing, especially with aggressive defense lawyers attacking my credibility for days on the witness stand. She said the plea terms sounded reasonable and would still result in Johnny having a permanent record and serious restrictions. Before I could call Evangeline with my answer, Doug contacted me with unexpected news. The sheriff's internal affairs investigation had become public knowledge somehow. Apparently, the state police had filed an official report detailing multiple policy violations, including improper storage of his backup weapon and attempts to interfere with their investigation. An ethics board hearing was now scheduled to review his conduct and determine appropriate disciplinary action. The news spread through town fast, with people talking about it everywhere I went. Doug called me again 2 days later and asked to meet somewhere private. We sat in his patrol car in an empty parking lot while he told me something confidential. Several other families had come forward with complaints about the sheriff covering for Johnny's behavior over the years. There was a clear pattern of property damage, harassment, and minor assaults that were never properly investigated or documented. The ethics board was taking all of it seriously because it showed systematic abuse of authority, not just one mistake. Doug said this could mean the sheriff losing his position entirely, not just a suspension. I sat there processing this information and realizing how many other people Johnny had hurt with his father's protection. 2 days later, Evangeline called me with news that Johnny's lawyer wanted to talk again. I met her at the DA's office that afternoon, and she laid out the revised offer on her desk. Johnny would accept adult charges instead of juvenile, which meant a permanent felony record that couldn't be sealed. The terms included 3 years of probation with strict conditions, full payment for all damages to the store and Jamie's car, mandatory anger management classes twice a week for a year, substance abuse counseling, and a permanent no-contact order covering both Jamie and me. In exchange, he'd avoid jail time entirely. Evangeline watched my face while I read through the paperwork, then told me she thought it was fair given the circumstances. The no-contact order was the strongest protection available, and the felony record meant Johnny couldn't own firearms or work in law enforcement. I asked her what would happen if we went to trial instead, and she explained it could take 8 to 12 months, and there was always risk with juries. I told her I needed to confirm some details before deciding. The next morning, I called Evangeline back and asked specifically about the no-contact order's scope. She confirmed it covered the store property, our homes, and anywhere we might reasonably be found, including Jamie's cousin's place. Johnny couldn't come within 500 feet of any of those locations. I agreed to accept the deal, and Evangeline said she'd notify Johnny's lawyer immediately. Meredith called me an hour later saying she'd heard about my decision and wanted to add some conditions. She spent the afternoon negotiating with Johnny's lawyer, and by evening she'd gotten them to agree that Johnny couldn't post anything about the case on social media, and his family was prohibited from contacting us directly or through other people. The formal plea hearing got scheduled for the following Tuesday. Gene called me into his office the next day looking tired but determined. He'd been working with corporate on new security measures, and they'd finally approved the budget. He walked me through the plans, pointing to diagrams on his desk showing panic buttons getting installed at every register position. The security system was getting upgraded with cameras that backed up footage to an off-site server automatically, so nobody could destroy the evidence. Corporate also agreed to require 2 employees working together after 8 p.m., which meant hiring another part-timer. Gene added a strict policy about trespassing where we'd call police immediately for anyone banned from the property, no warnings or second chances. He seemed almost excited showing me the protocols, like he was taking control of something that had felt out of control for months. I thanked him for fighting corporate on the expenses, and he just shrugged and said Catherine's articles about workplace safety had made them nervous about bad press. The sheriff's ethics hearing happened on Thursday, but it was closed to the public, so I didn't know anything until Catherine called me Friday afternoon. She'd gotten the results through her contacts at the county office. The sheriff was suspended for 60 days without pay and had to complete retraining courses on evidence handling and conflict of interest rules. It wasn't the firing that some people wanted, but Catherine said it was significant because it went on his permanent record and would affect his career. His department also had to implement new policies about storing personal firearms separately from duty weapons and rules preventing family members from getting special treatment. Doug called me that evening and said the suspension was actually a big deal in law enforcement circles because it showed the ethics board took the violation seriously. Tuesday morning arrived faster than I expected, and I put on my best clothes for the plea hearing. Meredith met me outside the courthouse and went over what would happen. The judge would ask me to give a victim impact statement describing how Johnny's actions affected my life and Jamie's health. I'd practiced what to say, but my hands started shaking the moment we walked into the courtroom. Johnny sat at the defense table in a button-up shirt looking nothing like the drunk kid who'd waved a pistol around my store. The judge called the hearing to order and asked the lawyers to present the plea agreement terms. Evangeline read through everything systematically while the judge took notes. Then the judge looked at me and asked if I wanted to make a statement. My voice came out shaky at first, but I pushed through it. I explained how I couldn't sleep for weeks after the party, how every time the door chimed at work my heart would race thinking Johnny was coming back. I described finding my tires slashed and wondering if I'd be next. I talked about Jamie's heart attack and how she'd almost died from the terror of seeing a gun pointed at her face. I mentioned the financial stress of paying for security cameras and lawyer fees when I was barely making rent. I told the judge about the nightmares where I watched Johnny's finger pull that trigger over and over. When I finished, the courtroom was completely quiet. The judge looked at Johnny and asked if he understood the harm he'd caused. Johnny mumbled something that sounded like an apology, but his lawyer had clearly coached him because it came out flat and rehearsed. The judge's expression showed she wasn't buying it. She accepted the plea agreement but added her own conditions on top of what the lawyers had negotiated. Johnny had to complete 200 hours of community service at a homeless shelter where he couldn't just show up and sign in, but actually had to work. He needed to maintain either full-time employment or enrollment in the school throughout his probation. He'd submit to random drug testing twice a month, and any positive result would violate his probation. The judge also required him to write a detailed letter of apology, explaining what he did and why it was wrong, which I could choose whether to read or not. She made it clear the no-contact order was permanent, not just for the probation period. If Johnny violated any condition, he'd go straight to jail to serve the original sentence. Meredith squeezed my arm as we left the courthouse, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for months. 3 days later, Meredith called with the news I'd been waiting for. The DA's office officially dropped any potential charges against me for throwing the register, ruling it justified self-defense given the immediate threat. I actually started crying right there in her office, and she handed me tissues while explaining that her final bill was significantly less than her usual rate. She said some cases were about doing the right thing more than making money, and she was glad she could help. I paid what I owed her that afternoon, grateful the nightmare was finally ending. Jamie started her new inventory position the following Monday, and I checked on her during my break. She was organizing stock in the back room, away from customers and registers and front doors. She looked calmer than I'd seen her in weeks, though she admitted she still had panic attacks sometimes when she heard loud noises. We worked out a system where she could text me if she needed support, and I'd come back to make sure she was okay. She was keeping up with her heart doctor appointments and taking her medication every day like she was supposed to. Gene had been true to his word about the employee assistance program, and I finally called the number to set up counseling. My first therapy appointment was on a Wednesday afternoon, and I felt awkward at first talking to a stranger about everything. But the therapist was patient and didn't judge me for any of it. She taught me techniques for grounding myself when I got triggered by sudden noises or people approaching too quickly. Progress was slow, but after a few weeks I noticed I was sleeping better and having fewer nightmares about that night. Gene pulled me aside one afternoon while I was restocking the cooler and said corporate wanted to talk to me. My stomach dropped thinking they were going to fire me after all, but his expression was different. He explained that corporate had been impressed by how I'd handled everything and wanted to promote me to assistant manager with a raise. The position came with more responsibility, but also better pay and benefits. I stood there feeling like this couldn't be real, getting something positive out of the worst experience of my life. I accepted right away, and Gene shook my hand looking genuinely happy for me. The extra money would help me pay off the rest of what I owed Meredith and start rebuilding my savings account that had gotten wiped out by lawyer fees and security equipment. Catherine's article hit the newspaper's website 2 days later with photos of our new security system and quotes from Gene about the changes we'd made. My phone buzzed that afternoon while I was organizing the back room, and Gene called me up front to show me his email inbox filling up with messages from other store owners across 3 counties asking about our panic buttons and camera setup. A hardware store owner drove over that same week to see our system in person and took notes on everything from the hidden alarm to the off-site backup storage. Gene seemed surprised that something good was actually coming from all the terrible stuff we'd been through, and he started putting together a basic guide to share with other businesses who reached out. The local Chamber of Commerce even asked him to give a presentation at their next meeting about workplace safety measures. 3 months passed faster than I expected, and one Tuesday afternoon I was restocking the drink cooler when the door chime went off behind me. I grabbed another case of soda and kept working without that jolt of fear shooting through my chest like it used to. It took me a second to realize what had just happened, or rather what hadn't happened. I actually slept through the whole night now without waking up to check the security cameras on my phone. I stopped spinning around every time someone walked up behind me in the grocery store. The security system did its job, and I trusted it to alert me if something was wrong instead of staying on high alert every single second. My therapist called it hypervigilance fading, and she was right about it being a gradual thing, but these small victories felt huge when I noticed them. Jamie found me in the stockroom the next morning while I was checking inventory on the computer. She leaned against the doorframe and told me she'd been thinking about going back to the school for business administration, using everything we went through to fuel a career change into workplace safety consulting. She wanted to help other businesses protect their employees, so maybe someone else wouldn't have to go through what we did. I looked up from the screen and told her that was an amazing idea, and I'd be happy to write her a reference letter whenever she needed it. She smiled for real, not that forced smile she'd been giving customers for months, and said she'd already requested information from the community college about their program. I felt proud watching her turn all that trauma into something with actual purpose, instead of just trying to forget it happened. The sheriff's announcement came through the local news website that Thursday evening. He wasn't running for re-election when his term ended, citing family reasons and wanting to spend more time with his son during this difficult period. Everyone in town knew the real reason was those ethics violations that had damaged his reputation beyond any repair. Doug stopped by the store on Friday during his lunch break and told me the department was already interviewing candidates from outside the county to make sure they got fresh leadership without all the local political baggage. He grabbed a coffee and a sandwich, and we talked by the register about how the whole department needed someone who'd actually enforce the rules fairly instead of protecting their own family. Johnny's court-ordered apology letter showed up in my mailbox on a Saturday afternoon, a thin envelope with the county clerk's return address. I held it for a minute, then walked straight to my file cabinet and stuck it in the folder with all the other legal documents without opening it. Meredith had told me weeks ago that I didn't owe him forgiveness or acknowledgement, and I was choosing to focus forward instead of backward. The letter stayed filed away in case I ever needed it for legal reasons, but emotionally I was done giving him any space in my head. He'd taken enough of my time and energy already. Jean and I spent the following Tuesday training 2 new employees on all the safety protocols we'd put in place. We ran through scenarios in the break room during the slow afternoon hours, showing them what to do if someone threatened them, how to use the panic buttons hidden under each register, and when to prioritize their safety over protecting store property. The younger guy asked good questions about the camera system and took notes on his phone. The woman who'd transferred from another location shared a story about a robbery at her old store where the manager had gotten hurt trying to stop the thieves. Both of them took the training seriously, which gave me actual confidence in our team, instead of that constant worry I'd been carrying around. 6 months after that terrible birthday party, we threw Jamie a proper celebration in the store's break room during the day with just our staff. Jean brought in a cake from the bakery down the street, and I hung up some silly decorations I'd grabbed from the dollar store. We kept it low-key and safe, nothing like that night when everything went wrong. Jamie actually laughed genuinely for the first time in months when Jean tried to light the candles and nearly set the frosting on fire. She cut the cake herself and told me while we were eating that she was grateful I'd been there that first night and every night after. I nodded and told her we'd gotten through it together, which was true even if it didn't feel like enough to say. Doug came by the store off duty the next week to update me on Johnny's situation. He grabbed a sports drink from the cooler and told me Johnny had completed all his community service hours and was now enrolled in a GED program while living with relatives in another county about 2 hours away. The no-contact order was still in effect and would be for the whole probation period, and Johnny's probation officer was apparently strict about enforcement and checking in regularly. Doug said it was honestly the best outcome we could have hoped for, giving Johnny accountability and consequences without completely ruining a young life. I appreciated Doug taking the time to let me know, even though part of me would have preferred never hearing Johnny's name again. I realized one evening while closing up that I actually felt safe in the store again. The security cameras were a comfort now instead of a constant reminder of what had happened. I checked each one before setting the alarm, and they just felt like tools doing their job. Jean had been trusting me with more responsibility as assistant manager, letting me handle scheduling and vendor orders and training. I was building an actual career here instead of just working a job to pay bills. The nightmare had somehow turned into a turning point, though I never would have believed that 6 months ago when I was throwing a cash register at someone holding a gun. Catherine called me the following Tuesday and asked if I'd be willing to do one final interview about long-term impacts and recovery. We met at the coffee shop down the street during my break, and I was honest with her about the ongoing challenges like the occasional panic attack or the way loud noises still made me jumpy sometimes. But I also emphasized the positive changes, the better security measures, the promotion, Jamie going back to the school, and how the whole experience had made me more aware of workplace safety issues. She wrote a balanced article that came out that weekend, acknowledging that trauma doesn't just disappear, but can be managed and overcome with time and support. Several people stopped by the store over the next few days to tell me they'd read it and that it helped them feel less alone in their own struggles with difficult experiences. The following Monday, Jean called me into his office and spread out printouts showing the store's monthly sales reports. The numbers had gone up steadily over the past few months, and he pointed to specific increases that started right after Catherine's articles ran about our security upgrades. He explained that corporate noticed the positive attention and wanted to open a second location across town, and they asked if I'd help design the security system and train the new staff there. I accepted immediately, realizing this job had turned into something bigger than just paying bills. 2 weeks later, Jamie rushed up to me during my shift waving an envelope from the community college. She got accepted into their business program with a scholarship for students returning to the school later in life, and her doctors had cleared her to start classes as long as she kept up with her medication and checkups. We celebrated that evening at the coffee shop down the street, ordering drinks and making plans to study together when our schedules matched up. She admitted she was nervous about being the oldest student in most of her classes, but the excitement in her voice made it clear she was ready for this change. On a quiet Tuesday night 3 weeks after that, I went through my closing routine like I'd done hundreds of times before. I checked each camera feed one by one, making sure everything was clear, then set the alarm system and locked the front door. My phone buzzed with a text from Jamie wishing me good night and good luck on my assistant manager exam the next morning. I drove home through empty streets, feeling tired from the long shift, but somehow content with how things had turned out. We'd survived something terrible that could have broken us completely, but instead we'd built better systems, found new opportunities, and came out stronger than we'd been before. The nightmare had turned into a strange kind of turning point that changed both our lives in ways we never expected. That is where we will end for today. I am really glad you were here because it makes telling these stories so much more meaningful. I hope this one left you feeling calm and maybe a little inspired. Subscribe if you would like to join me for the next one.